As I get started tonight, one quick reminder for those who are a regular part of our congregation here. On Wednesday night, the elders have decided that it would probably be easier for all parties involved to dismiss our classes and just all gather in here and sing for a while together. And that way we won't be scrambling to find subs and so forth. So that's what we'll do on Wednesday night. And if you're going to be here Wednesday and you would like to be one of the song leaders, just shoot me an email and let me know, and I can get you on the list. Last year on Christmas Eve, our family gathered down in Williamsburg, and I brought with me a book that I'd always wanted to read but never had, and decided this will be the time to do it. So Christmas Eve, everybody else went to bed. I went out in the living room, found a very comfortable place to sit with some good light, and I read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I had purchased it a few years before with all these intentions of, becoming a more literate person, but just never had read it. So I decided to read it last year. And I know I'm very late to the party here, but Charles Dickens, he was a good writer. And if you've never read A Christmas Carol before, I would encourage you to check it out. And so last night, I went over to the Florida College campus and saw a stage production of A Christmas Carol in the form of like an old-time radio show presentation. So it was really interesting, having read it last year, to then see these people bring it to life, at least if you could imagine what a radio performance of it would be like. It was curious, though, watching that production last night, because ordinarily when you go to a play, you see what goes on stage, but there's a curtain, and then behind the curtain there's a lot more going on. But because they were presenting A Christmas Carol as if it was a live radio performance, everything was there in front of you. There was no front stage and then behind the curtain. Instead, everything was there. So you could see all of the actors, even when they were not up at one of the microphones performing. If they were just sitting down, waiting for their next cue, you could just see them sitting in the background. And like over here on this part of the stage, they had all of the sound effect equipment like you would have used for a 1940s radio show. So I was sitting like right here. So it was really interesting to see all of the little gizmos they used to recreate some of the sound effects. That's normally, though, not what it's like. If you go to the Straz to watch your performance, you recognize that whatever's going on in front of the curtain, there's a lot more going on behind the curtain. And if you go to a movie, there might be hundreds of people involved in the cast of the movie when you count all the extras, but you know that when the credits roll, there's just going to be that many more names that are listed because so much more is taking place behind the scenes. I kind of want to talk about that tonight, that concept with you. Seeing the big picture, realizing that there's more going on if you were able to pull the curtain back. And the way that I want to begin tonight is by looking at two chapters we all know, the chapters in the Gospels that record the birth of Jesus, as an illustration of this point. So if you would begin with me tonight by looking in Luke's Gospel, in Luke the 2nd chapter, Luke chapter 2, and we can just start here in verse 1. Luke 2 verse 1 says, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered." This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. If you use the English Standard Version on the word inn, you see a footnote that says guest room, and more that's what commentators think this word refers to. So in your mind, if you have this elaborate story worked out of Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus looking for a room in the Ramada Inn and not finding one, that's probably not what's being described here. What's probably being described is that they were at a private residence and there was a guest room, but the room was crowded, and so the only place they could put the baby Jesus was in the part of the house where they kept the animals. And in the manger is where Jesus laid. All right, that's Luke's account. Go with me now to Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 2. A much different atmosphere in this description. Matthew chapter 2 tells us the story of the visit of the wise men, first to King Herod, to explain that one born of the King of the Jews was about to arrive. And they had seen his star and wanted to worship him. Herod summoned them, Matthew tells us in verse 7 of chapter 2, to try to find out exactly when this happened, and pinpoints that it took place in the city of Bethlehem. He sends the wise men, of course, under the guise of presenting homage, but in reality, just to pinpoint more specifically locations. Of course, they don't cooperate. And verse 16 says, then Herod, when he saw he'd been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Most likely this suggests that the events here are within 2 years of the events of Luke chapter 2, because in order to make sure the baby Jesus is killed, Herod gives the order to wipe out all of the infants within a span of 2 years. This is the scene, you might say, in front of the curtain. And what I'm about to say may come across like I'm trying to diminish or downplay the significance of what we just read. And I don't mean to do that at all. But I do want you at least to consider the realities of what we just read in light of the real world. There is nothing out of the ordinary about a peasant couple in the first century having a child. That happened all the time. And tragically, there's nothing out of the ordinary about a petty Middle Eastern tyrant paranoid to keep his power. That basically tells the story of Middle Eastern politics for roughly 2,000 years. Nor is it really that out of the ordinary for many innocents to be killed. The city of Bethlehem would not have been a city at all. It would have been a very small village in the first century. And even when you factor in the region surrounding Bethlehem, which Matthew talks about here in Matthew 2, if you were to think about the scope of the region and the very narrow range of the children involved here, 2 years old and younger, then it's quite possible that in some of the mass shootings we have unfortunately seen in the news over the last few years, there may have been more children killed in those, maybe, than here. What I'm trying to get at is the scale of events as you read about them in Luke and in Matthew. If you think about them in terms of what's going on in front of the curtain, is relatively small and by worldly standards maybe even almost obscure. But what I want you to see is there's also a lot more going on behind the curtain. And to get the behind the curtain look at these events, I want you to go with me to the last book of the Bible, to Revelation, to the 12th chapter. Now, there's nothing like jumping right smack dab into the middle of the book of Revelation on a Sunday night sermon, right? With no warning and no context. But it turns out that this is one of the places you can do that pretty easily because the vivid symbolism here is so obvious in terms of what it is conveying. Revelation chapter 12 begins with a vision of a woman described in cosmic terms. Revelation 12:1 says, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. John here trying to convey to us just the overwhelming cosmic significance of this woman. It may call to mind some descriptions in the Old Testament of Israel and Jerusalem as a woman, as God's bride, as a bride who is decked out for her husband. In verse 2, the text says she was pregnant and crying out in birth pains and in the agony of giving birth. It is hard to imagine a more vulnerable person than a woman on the verge of giving birth. I made the point about Mary this morning that birth is always a dangerous proposition for the mother, and especially in the first century. There's almost no one more vulnerable than a woman just as she is about to give birth, which makes the next detail in this vision all the more horrifying. Verse 3 says, another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon. So it's a dragon. It's a monster. And those familiar with the Old Testament will recognize passages like Daniel 7, which pictures world empires in the terms of monstrous, grotesque beasts, or images like from the book of Job and the book of Isaiah, which describe the forces of chaos and evil as a giant sea monster called Leviathan. That's kind of the picture that we are given here. It's a great dragon, and it's red, the color of blood, which conveys the danger and violence inherent in this monster. It has 7 heads, which means it's incredibly cunning and intelligent. 10 horns, which symbolize power and strength in the Bible. And on his head, 7 diadems, diadems reflecting authority. So a great, monstrous, evil authority. Now, I wish the book of Revelation always did this, but it just so happens that there's actually a cast list for this production. And down in verse 9, John tells us who this is. The great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. So do you see the picture here? There is the devil himself hovering over this woman who is about to give birth. And just to emphasize what on the surface seems like a horribly one-sided mismatch, not only is this woman in the vulnerable position of about to give birth, and not only is this dragon huge, he's so huge and powerful. Verse 4 says his tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. He's so mighty that with just one sweep of his tail, 1/3 of the stars of the heavens come crashing down. And verse 4 explains, the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, she might devour it. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. That's not this picture, is it? Nothing still about this picture. Do you see that what John is doing here in Revelation 12 is he's saying, okay, I know the story you all saw on stage in Luke and in Matthew. But what I want to do is I want to draw the curtain back, and I want you to see there is a much bigger reality. And the conflict that we see hints of in Matthew with the wicked King Herod trying to snuff out the life of this newborn king of the Jews, that in fact that's just simply one small reflection of a much deeper, much grander scale of conflict between the people of God and the birth of the Messiah and the evil one. Now you would think, given the description here, that this little baby who is the only creature, by the way, more vulnerable than a woman in labor, is the little baby she's about to give birth to. You would think there's just no chance for this little baby when this gigantic, deadly, evil dragon swoops in. And yet, verse 5 says, she gave birth to a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, which is our clue. For those who know the book of Psalms, Psalm 2, this is the Messiah. So we know clearly what this is describing. It is the birth of our King Jesus, and yet there is no showdown. It's not like the little baby even has to crawl around and try to hide somewhere. I mean, literally, there's no conflict, because no sooner is the man-child born, but that he is caught up to God and to his throne. This is John's way of saying, oh, I know. Jesus was born, he was hunted down, his family had to flee to Egypt, they came back, and then he endured years of opposition and hostility and numerous attempts on his life, and then finally he was taken, and yes, he was put to death, and he was crucified. Previously in the book, he talks about the blood of the Lamb. John is well aware of that. Remember, he stood at the cross and saw it happen, and yet what he's saying is, but if you want to see that in light of the big picture, here is the big picture. The devil could not lay a glove on King Jesus, because Jesus in his resurrection and ascension completely triumphed over him. That's the big picture John wants us to see. In a way, it's one of the most anticlimactic stories in the Bible. The way it's set up and what you're led to expect is going to happen. I mean, the only aftermath of this is that once the great dragon is defeated, that he goes on to pursue the woman and her children, us, in other words. And that's how chapter 12 ends. Now, here is the point that I want you to see. There is a bigger reality at work. And in that reality, what looks almost hopeless and pointless from a worldly point of view, once you pull the curtain back and see God's deeper purposes are in action, you realize the cause of God is going to triumph. So now I want to give you some applications of looking at the big picture, to realize that there are greater spiritual realities at work than we can see with the human eye. And one area in which I think it's important for us to see this is with regard to history. Now, here in just a minute, I'm going to read from Daniel chapter 10. So if you want to make your way there, I'm going to take a second to give you some background, but I'm going to read from Daniel chapter 10. So you know from your study of the Bible that Daniel witnessed several earth-shattering events in history. First of all, according to the opening verses of the book of Daniel, he was taken hostage from his homeland as a member of the royal family of the house of David and carried off to Babylon. So he goes from one country to another, and then toward the end of his life, he sees another earth-shattering event as the Persians invade and conquer Babylon. In fact, chapter 5 tells us the famous story of the vision of the handwriting on the wall, and that very night it says the king Belshazzar died and the Persians came into the city of Babylon. If I was Daniel, now just be clear with you, the text never says this, but if I was Daniel, and I had gone through all of those twists and turns of history, a hostage, a captive in a foreign country, I would be very discouraged about the prospects for my people and my nation. It just seems like the tide of events is swirling out of control. And yet in Daniel chapter 10, this is I gotta be honest, because we're pulling the curtain back, you're gonna see a lot of things backstage that just blow your mind, and it's hard to really fully process. This is one of those. In Daniel chapter 10, he says in verse 4, on the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river that is the Tigris, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning. It's an angel. Daniel sees an angelic vision. And in verse 10 he says, behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words I speak to you, and stand upright, for now I've been sent to you. And when he spoke this to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, fear not. I just can't help but remind you, every time nearly in the Bible somebody receives a vision of an angel, it terrifies them. So I know that in art, maybe even some of the pieces of art I've shown you over the last couple of weeks, angels are sometimes pictured as these pudgy little pink babies floating around. They must not have looked like that in these visions, given how terrifying they were. But he says, I want you to get up. And in verse 12, you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God. Your words have been heard, and I've come because of your words. Now listen to verse 13. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. What in the world is going on here? Daniel sees a vision of an angel, and he says, I wanted to get here earlier. I got tied up, and the holdup was I was having to slug it out with the prince of Persia. Now, I think the point of this passage is simply to say this, that all of those historical events Daniel was experiencing on the street level actually reflected a much bigger set of spiritual realities that were taking place. And here's the good news. What that means is whatever is happening on the front side of the stage that sometimes discourages us and sometimes causes us to be so disappointed, as I'm sure you often are, as I am, at the way things seem to go sometimes. We need to remember, like Daniel needed to remember, there is more going on here. God is at work on a level that you don't have access to, that you don't know about. But Daniel, be of good courage. Fear not. So you and I have to have the hope that history is going somewhere under the lordship of Jesus Christ, and that what we see on the stage, so to speak, doesn't nearly reflect all that's going on behind the curtain. All right? Now I want to meddle in your personal lives. Go with me to Ephesians chapter 6. I want you to think about this with regard to temptation. Now, I'm going to show you, first of all, a description of something happening, you might say, on the front side of the curtain, on stage. This is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. You have a situation in which tempers fly, anger flares. Paul says, don't let that happen. Well, I guess it's going to happen, but don't let the sun go down on your anger. Don't let unresolved anger well up within you, all right? Now, that's what's going on the street level. Now we're going to zoom out to the big picture. Now we're going to pull the curtain back. This is verse 27. And give no opportunity to the devil. So here's what Paul is saying, and here's why I said I'm going to meddle in all of our lives right now. I want you to think about the last time you became angry. I hope that it's been more than 45 minutes ago, all right? Because if you got angry, you're like, here, I mean, we got real problems, all right? But so maybe you got angry on the ride here. Maybe somebody was slow. Maybe somebody was driving too fast. Maybe you couldn't change lanes. Maybe that's when you got angry. Maybe you got angry today because you wanted your kid to go take a nap and your child adamantly refused, and you got angry at your child. Maybe you got angry because your spouse worked hard to provide you a good meal and they did not get any kind of thanks, and so they became angry. I don't know what it is, but I want you to think about the last time you got angry. Here's what I want you to see. There's more going on in that moment than just the simple set of circumstances that made you angry. What Paul says here is very similar to what the Lord said to Cain when he warned him in Genesis chapter 4, Cain, sin desires you and it is crouching at the door. What's the big deal? It's just a spat between brothers. One just happens to be resentful and jealous of the other. Yeah, guess what happened? The evil one exploited that and led a brother to murder his brother. Paul says, don't you understand that when you are angry, this is the very moment in time in which the evil one is looking for an opportunity to do you harm? This is why he warns in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 11 or verse 12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. All of the temptations that we face in life, even something like anger in a family, Paul is saying, don't you see there are greater spiritual realities at work? And it ought to sober us to realize that. Some of you know some of us have been gathering together on Monday nights to read through C.S. Lewis's classic book, The Screwtape Letters, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a book of letters written by a demon named Screwtape to his nephew Wormwood to explain how to cause somebody to fall into sin. So it's a way of telling Christians, here's what to be on guard against, but from an imaginative direction. In the third letter, there are 2 paragraphs that made me laugh out loud like an imbecile on the plane when I read them that I want to share with you tonight. And the backdrop is the man that Wormwood is trying to cause to stumble has just become a Christian and he lives with his mom. And here's what Screwtape says. When 2 humans have lived together for many years, it usually happens that each has tones of voice and expressions of face which are almost unendurably irritating to the other. Work on that. Bring fully into the consciousness of your patient that particular lift of his mother's eyebrows, which he learned to dislike as a baby. Let him think how much he dislikes it. Let him assume she knows how annoying it is and does it to annoy. And if you know your job, he will not notice the immense improbability of that assumption. And of course, never let him suspect that he has tones and looks which similarly annoy her. As he cannot see or hear himself, this is easily managed. And then he says this, in civilized life, domestic hatred usually expresses itself by saying things which would appear quite harmless on paper, but in such a voice or at such a moment that they are not far short of a blow to the face. To keep this game up, you must see to it that each of these 2 fools has a sort of double standard. Your patient must demand that all his utterances are to be taken at their face value and judged simply on the actual words, while at the same time judging all his mother's utterances with the fullest and most oversensitive interpretation. She must be encouraged to do the same to him. Hence, from every quarrel, they can both go away convinced that they are quite innocent. You know the kind of thing. I simply ask her what time dinner would be, and she flies into a rage. Once this habit is well established, you have the delightful situation of a human saying things with the express purpose of offending, and yet having a grievance when offense is taken. When's dinner going to be ready? Has that ever caused an argument at your house? I'm glad, Preston. I'm glad to hear that. Count yourself lucky, my friend. Because in many of our homes, that expression, that question has caused a horrible argument. And here's the reason. Because the evil one is at work. And he is at work on levels that we don't see with the naked eye, but are real nonetheless. But the thing is, the Bible doesn't want us to lose heart when we acknowledge this, quite the opposite. Once we realize that there is this struggle going on at this deeper, more profound level, it also encourages us to go to God for the help that he gives us. And just as surely as the cosmic picture in Revelation 12 is designed to show us that yes, the evil one is quite formidable, but Jesus Christ is all the more powerful, that when the Bible reminds us that, for example, there's a bigger part to history than we see, it should encourage us that God is the one who puts kings on their thrones, and that the kingdoms of the world are in his hand. And when the Bible tells us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of evil, it is to remind us that we can stand firm. We just need to know that's where the battle's being fought. So there's a bigger picture with regard to our temptation. And since we're focused on the family this quarter, I want to just remind all of us, all families here, to realize that those moments of anger in your family life, as husband and wife and parent and children and sibling to sibling, just be aware those moments of anger are more than simple human clashes. They are opportunities for the evil one to work, unless we go to God and put on the armor of God that is more than capable of protecting us. Here's another reality to think about. The book of Job starts out. If you're Job, what do you see on stage in front of the curtain? Well, you get a series of messages. Raiders have come and taken the oxen and donkeys and servants. You get another message. Fire from heaven has consumed the sheep and some servants. Another message, raiders came and took away all your camels and more of your servants. Another message follows close by. A great wind has blown down the house where all of your children were. They've all passed away. That's what's going on out here. Not long after, Job finds himself covered in loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. That's in front of the curtain. Now, of course, we know there is a lot more going on behind the curtain. We know that there was the presentations of the sons of God before the throne of God. We know that the accuser made vile accusations about Job. Job only fears you because you've put a hedge around him and you've given him a bunch of stuff. But Job wouldn't fear you if you took it all away. Does Job fear God for nothing? No, you've bought him off. Take away the hedge. Take away all his stuff. He'll curse you to your face. Oh yeah, you took away all of his stuff? Well, that's because nothing happened to him personally, but you put your hand on him, and skin for skin, all a man has, he'll give for his life. Touch Job, and he'll curse you to his face. That's the story behind the scenes. And so far as we know, Job never learns about that part of the story. But here's what Job does learn. As you may recall from our study of the book of Job early last year, at the end of the book, the climax of the book, is when Job receives what he begged for, what he demanded all through the book, a personal invitation to talk to God. The Lord speaks to him twice and essentially says two things to Job. Job, number one, I'm the creator. There's a lot going on in my provision and care for my creation than you're aware of. And number two, Job, I know that there are forces of evil and chaos in this world. You're not powerful enough to deal with them. I am. Will you trust me? And at the end of the book, Job says, Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Job learned there was a lot more going on behind the curtain. There was a bigger story at work. It's bigger than he knows, so far as we know from the text. It's much bigger than he ever knew. He didn't need to know all of that. He just needed to know that his suffering wasn't pointless. His suffering was not meaningless. And that in fact, in God's point of view, his suffering had eternal significance. And so he doesn't curse God like the evil one said he would. A little bit later in the Screwtape letter, Screwtape says this to his nephew. Be not deceived, Wormwood, our cause is never more in jeopardy than when a human no longer desiring but still intending to do our enemy's will. Of course, that's the way he looks at God. Looks round upon a universe in which every trace of him seems to have vanished and asks why he has been forsaken and still obeys. In other words, the evil one is never more in jeopardy than when we realize there is a much bigger picture than any of us can see. And that through God, we can deal with what happens to us because there is a much greater story ahead of us than for right now we can see. And that really is the story, seems to me, of the birth of Jesus. And that's the story we invite all of you to make your story tonight. To realize that you've got to live for more than this small picture of what we can see by the naked eye. By what this world and its temporary nature has to offer. That you need to live for something that is truly bigger, truly significant, truly eternal. And that is what our Lord has made possible for us through his life and his death and his resurrection. And if we can help any of you tonight as you engage in that story, let us know while we stand and sing together.